Anime magazines are absolutely fascinating. I love reading these because each of them is not only a snapshot of the time period when the magazine was released, but always full of weird, random information that often hasn't really survived into the internet age, or can just give you little slices and tidbits of stuff that you didn't know would be important at the time, but would later become important. Like, for instance, hearing about a director who at the time was unheard of, but then later would go on to become mega famous, and then you go back and read a magazine where they were interviewing them after their first work when nobody cared. There's just so much that can be gained from looking back at old anime magazines, especially really old ones from a time that isn't talked about as much anymore. You know, magazines that talk about shows that maybe aren't as much in the public consciousness today. Now, I've been meaning to start up a show about anime magazines for quite some time. Originally, I was going to just do one long video about each different publication and sort of summarize the structure, what it's all about, like what are the stylistic trappings of the magazine, because I am interested in them on like a meta level. I love looking at the way different magazines are constructed. But there's also just so much fun information that I come across in these magazines that it would be a real disservice to just group the entire magazine into one video when I find so many little things to talk about. Originally, when I made plans to do a video series on anime magazines, I was going to make a Twitter account that was attached to it, which I would like just take pictures of interesting articles from magazines and stuff and like post them on there. But a lot of what makes these articles interesting is not necessarily present in the text. Like, I would have to explain why it's interesting to me. So instead, I figured, why not do a weekly series in which I talk about individual magazines and what I found in them that intrigued me so much. So here we have issue number 32 of Protoculture Addicts, which is the January/February 1995 issue. Protoculture Addicts was a bi-monthly magazine that, going by what I've read in the few of these that I have read, seems to have lacked the budget and manpower to go monthly. They wanted to, but they couldn't. It was around for most of the 90s and then kind of unceremoniously shut down, I guess. They were one of a few anime magazines coming out at the time. Animerica was also around then, and they were monthly. But Protoculture Addicts is really interesting because it is definitely presenting itself as being for hardcore anime fans. This magazine has a lot of expectations for the kind of readers who were going to be picking it up. It kind of expects you to already be deeply ingrained into anime culture and to understand sort of the talking points and stuff that are going on commonly in the fan base. And it's also kind of meant to be a helpful instructional guide on like where to find anime, what shows to watch, what's getting talked about, because back in the 90s there was not an open internet where everyone was discussing anime, and shows were definitely not easy to come by. So a lot of this functions as a buyer's guide and just keeping you informed about what anime are coming out, what manga are coming out, which stuff is releasing in Japan that might come to the US later, or just even telling you about stuff that's airing in Japan just so you can know about it. Like, just to have the fun of having as much information about anime and Japanese culture as you possibly can. But right off the bat with this thing, you really get the tone set. First of all, the title, Protoculture Addicts, protoculture being a reference to the Macross series, known more commonly as Robotech, because that was the American name of the series, and it's the one that was super popular, and, you know, that gets referenced a lot in this magazine. But even more so than the Macross reference, the fact that the cover story is what today would be considered a very obscure 90s OVA called The Cockpit, that was an adaptation of the stories of Leiji Matsumoto, who you'll see here, it just says Matsumoto's The Cockpit, because in the early mid-90s, if you were an anime fan, you were expected to know who Leiji Matsumoto was. He's one of the most important manga authors and, you know, anime-related individuals of all time, having created Space Battleship Yamato, which is one of the most influential anime of the 70s, Galaxy Express 999, Captain Harlock, Queen Emeraldis. Some of his stuff is starting to get released here in the US, finally, like Queen Emeraldis. The manga is, you know, on the shelves of Barnes & Noble now, but it's a old-ass manga, and he's hugely influential. So the fact that his name was on this thing at all was enough to make it important in the 90s. Today, most Western fans probably don't even know who Leiji Matsumoto is, especially in the US, where none of his shows ever really, like, caught on in a mainstream way. I mean, if you know his work, you probably know him from Interstellar 5555, the Daft Punk Discovery album movie, because he directed that. But otherwise, it's mainly really hardcore fans who know who he is. And for what it's worth, it would have been hardcore fans back then as well, but an anime magazine was geared towards hardcore fans, whereas these days you pick up a magazine like Otaku USA and it's geared for the mainstream. It's geared for people who don't know everything about anime to pick up and be able to learn something about the medium. This magazine opens with an editorial by the editor-in-chief and publisher of the magazine, Claude J. Pelletier. And it's pretty heavy-hitting for an opening part of the magazine. It's about, like, this experience that he had talking to soldiers with, like, PTSD and stuff, and, like, basically checking his privilege because he realizes how, like, you know, how lucky he is to live the life that he does, and then connecting this to The Cockpit, which is a very serious war drama series of stories. It was definitely interesting to open up the magazine and immediately get hit with some really heavy shit. And after that, what's interesting about the next few pages is that they are a straight up buyer's guide. It's literally just a list of new releases that are coming out in video and manga. They've got the prices on all of them, like they often put in like the ID numbers of the videos, like, so that you could go in to, like, I don't know, a computer or go to Blockbuster and, like, give them this number and, like, have them look it up. Like, they go all out on making sure you know as much as possible specifically about the releases, because, again, watching anime back then meant getting a hold of videos. You know, you had to either purchase or rent or be sharing videos with your friends, so, like, having this data is kind of the most important thing, which is why it's front and center in the magazine. Really reminds me of when I used to read, like, Beckett Pokemon Collector back in the late 90s, where they would have full lists of every Pokemon card and its current asking price, like its eBay listing price, essentially, so that you could always know what all of your cards were worth at all times when you go to trade them and stuff at events. The next section is just basically a bunch of borderline advertising copy about a bunch of new releases, but a couple of these interested me. First is this manga compilation magazine called Manga Visions, which was being put out by Viz, which I guess was the first attempt ever at doing a manga compilation magazine in the US. Viz would end up doing a whole bunch of these. First they did this Manga Visions, they did Pulp, which was supposed to be adult-oriented manga. I've got a couple of volumes of that, issues of that rather. And then later they of course did Shonen Jump Monthly, which was the first manga magazine to take off in the US. You know, after a decade of, like, trying to do this and none of them really being a success, Shonen Jump obviously blew up pretty big. I found out about manga via Shonen Jump, in fact. But even more interesting than that for me, this little piece on Ghost in the Shell. This is about the Ghost in the Shell manga. And remember, this magazine is from January to February 1995. So the film, directed by Mamoru Oshii, was not even out in Japan yet. This little write-up is just introducing it as like, it's a new thing from Masamune Shirow. Like, it's a new manga about cyborg detectives, and it's releasing issue by issue from Dark Horse in the 90s. Like, not even a graphic novel, just a regular ass manga. Ghost in the Shell is just some footnote in this magazine, because it has not yet become, like, what we would all know it as, this international sensation that helped to bring popularity to anime in the West. You know, this magazine is older than Ghost in the Shell bringing notoriety to anime in the West. That's the kind of hardcore we're talking about for the people who would have been reading this. And actually, it's pretty surprising just how much anime was even coming out at the time. Like, it's pretty shocking to realize that stuff like Bubblegum Crisis and 3x3 Eyes were already getting US releases in this period where anime is not really a big deal. Like, a lot of these I've seen re-releases of later, and would have just assumed that once anime blew up in the late 90s with stuff like Ghost in the Shell, Ninja Scroll, Evangelion, you know, I'm surprised that these weren't all, like, brought up in the late 90s, like after their time. Realizing that stuff that was new at the time was being released is kind of interesting. Did you know that Tenchi Muyo was around in the mid-90s? I didn't even realize Tenchi was that old. Now, something which doesn't surprise me is that the defensiveness over what anime is was already well in full swing at the time of this magazine. We've got the spotlight on Leiji Matsumoto's The Cockpit, which begins thusly. If you ask the average person what anime is about, you will get something like this: pretty girls, sex and violence, giant robots. If you asked an informed anime fan, you may get a more informed answer. There are many kinds of anime: science fiction, comedy, martial arts, mecha robots, sexual, fantasy, adventure. However, there's one category of anime that would probably not be mentioned, mostly because it has been largely ignored. That category is historical fiction. And then it goes on about The Cockpit. So yeah, funnily enough, this same argument would be going today. Like, if you ask people what anime is, they're going to give you those same answers, and the more informed fan is going to have the same response. But one of the funny things about this magazine is that there actually is a lot of attention paid to outright pornographic anime, because it was such a fact of life of the period. Like, a lot of the anime coming out stateside was pornographic, and that was part of the appeal, was that you get to see these fucking weird cartoons from Japan with all this crazy sexually explicit content. So in here, there are, like, you know, reviews and, like, announcements about porn tapes, which is pretty great, and you don't get that in, like, modern magazines. Another thing they would often do with, like, major OVA releases that they were talking about in this magazine is just straight up summarize every episode. Like, you go through several pages of just literal recaps with screenshots of the episodes of the series, because again, these things were hard to come by at the time. I mean, I don't know how easy even this magazine was to come by at the time, but you know, even if these videos did get released stateside, they weren't going to come out all at once, and you were probably going to have some difficulty tracking down a place that actually carried them. So this magazine will have extensive episode guides and summaries for these shows, just in case you want to experience them vicariously, or hear the plot and think that sounds cool, I'm going to go try to seek that out. And this tradition would continue into sort of the modern age of magazines, but I think it died out at some point. Like, I remember the first issue of Anime Invasion, which was my first anime magazine, had a full episode guide to Macross. Like, it describes every episode plot of Macross. So, you know, I definitely remember that being a thing in anime magazines, but maybe less so as time went on, and it became that you could easily find these things. Here's a feature that really interested me and prompted me to finally go ahead and record this video on a series called Fiona on the Marvelous Island, which was known in the US as Swiss Family Robinson. This is one of the World Masterpiece Theater shows, which, for those who don't know, from like 1969 up till 94 or so, there was a long ongoing series of Western novel adaptations called World Masterpiece Theater, where they'd make usually a 49-50 episode show out of a piece of Western literature. And they were usually sort of slow, slice-of-lifey dramas. Like, they're all like hardcore dramas, but they have a very slow pace that takes you, like, really gets you intimate with the lives of the characters, and like just kind of evolves the drama in a naturalistic way, I guess is the word I would use. And this is where guys like Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata got their start, was working on the World Masterpiece Theater series before they eventually left to go form Ghibli. What was really interesting to me about this article is a piece of information that I have never heard, and I couldn't find on Wikipedia afterwards, or I didn't search that hard online, but I've never seen this piece of info before. It says, produced in 1981 by Nippon Animation and Fuji 8, it is a delightful retelling of the old classic Swiss Family Robinson. Mark Tuttle currently manages the property in North America for a company named PMT. He kindly filled me in on the background of the series. In Japan, Fuji 8 had a regular slot called The Mother and Daughter Time on Sunday morning TV in the early 80s, which they filled with animated versions of historical and contemporary classics. Fiona on the Marvelous Island was a part of this series. It originally ran for 49 episodes, each telling a self-contained story. PMT has translated and dubbed the entire series into English and should be given high compliments on their excellent and professional rendering. There's real acting and voice character throughout, blah, blah, blah. So I've never heard of this mother and daughter time slot, but it suddenly made World Masterpiece Theater, at least a lot of the series in it, made a lot more sense to me, having known that, because a lot of them are shows about little girls in 19th century Europe, like, coming of age. Like, there are a lot of, you got Anne of Green Gables, you've got Trap Family Ika, you've got, like, what's another one? Heidi of the Alps, like, all these shows about a cute little girl in the 19th century growing up. And they're all, like, pretty hardcore dramas, and they're definitely aimed in such a way that they don't shy away from any, like, adult themes. Like, they usually contain scenes of violence, death, really harsh drama, because they're meant to be watched as mother and daughter, which, I don't know, that is incredibly fascinating to me, just to realize that bit of intentionality and to see it kind of make perfect sense in my mind. I don't know if this was, like, common to all the World Masterpiece Theater shows, because a lot of them are, like, when you get to, for instance, Future Boy Conan, like, I can't see that one being as much of a mother-daughter thing, and this said it was from the early 80s, but, like, something that doesn't nearly get talked about enough with anime is how important time slots are, how important programming blocks are, because a lot of anime is made to fit within these certain blocks, certain time frames that they are aired, and, like, it's pretty consistent, like, the attitude of shows released in a certain time slot. The only one anybody really talks about is Noitamina, and I think that's just because Noitamina always has a bumper at the start of their shows that fucking has their name on it. But, yeah, I'm definitely interested to know what all the shows were that were in this mother and daughter time slot. If anybody has that information, by all means, post it in the comments, because I would love to know. Not unlike more modern anime magazines, this one occasionally forays into non-anime or manga-related aspects of Japanese culture, primarily with these CD reviews of just a couple of popular releases, I guess, of Japanese music on CD. That's about it. There's not a focus on video games in here. I really don't think that would become a thing until a little bit later, like, because if you open a modern anime magazine, there's almost always some kind of section on anime-related video games or just Japanese-style games. Then we get into this really lengthy and interesting just in that it exists article, those perverted sex and violence cartoons, which is, again, just a huge defense of the fact that anime is not just sex and violence, and sort of just an explanation of why people like anime, like why this genre, why this medium, going on and on about comparing it to Disney and how in Japan, here's a great phrase that you've probably heard 1,000 times. In Japan, anime is treated as an art form, and its artists are household names, treated virtually as living national treasures. There is packaged stock fare anime, but it rises above this level, and so often and so regularly when compared to its Western cousin as to be treated with a distinct respect. So, yeah, it's that kind of thing. The same kind of shit that people are still writing to this fucking day. More than 10 years ago in this magazine. No, more than 20 years ago in this magazine, I meant to say. More than 10 years ago would not be that impressive. But the funny thing to me about this is that this article about how anime is not all sex and violence is right next to a fucking Project A-ko ad, which is literally just fan service and violence. Like, that is the point of Project A-ko. It's just a really fun OVA about, violence and cute girls in their underwear. Then we got a pretty big calendar here, a full color. This is the only page in the magazine that's actually in color. I really like the aesthetic of it, but it's a 1995 calendar with some Central Park Media characters, which apparently Central Park Media were the biggest distributor of anime at the time. Every time they're brought up in here, they're mentioned as being the largest distributor of anime in the U.S., which would cease to be true probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, when guys like ADV and Funimation really kicked up their game. And fucking pioneer. This article goes on forever, by the way. It's like 4 pages. It's like a real diatribe about shit that you probably know already. Oh, and immediately after that is a feature about Go Nagai, about spending. There's 2 different features in here about people writing about their time spent with these famous manga authors, like just people who hung out with them and experienced life alongside them. I just think it's ironic because Go Nagai, of course, is best known for sex and violence cartoons. Here's an interesting quote from Go Nagai's wife in here, Sumiko-san. She says, when we went to various countries, I really realized how lucky I am to live in a peacetime Japan without any threat of civil wars and so on. After I saw all those poor people in the Philippines, I can't even eat a banana without feeling guilty. We rich people are exploiting the poor nations and using their land to grow what we eat. My chest aches when I look at bananas. I guess Japan gets all their bananas from the Philippines, or at least they did. There's a part in here where she refers to her husband, Go Nagai, as Go-chan. She's talking about going to an anime convention in Italy. She says, Italian people seem to love comics, and Go-chan's robots were so popular there. We get many fan mails from Italy, but we can't read Italian, so we have to ask translators. Just admiring hearing Go-chan. This is followed by a piece about the wonderful days with Akemi Takada, who did the anime's designs for Maison Ikoku and I think Kimagure Orange Road. There's also an interesting bit of like drama in here where it's talking about how Akemi Takada was married to the guy who wrote Patlabor, Kazunori Ito. And, yeah, they got divorced at some point, and I guess there was, like, they were being asked questions about it, and she wasn't comfortable, but then, now she sort of addresses the situation in this book. But yeah, I think it's interesting that this was even brought up, that there's, like, this relationship drama between, the character designers for Kimagure Orange Road and the guy who wrote Patlabor. Really interesting. But yeah, she just talks generally about like being a character designer and all the work that goes into it. How when you design character designers for TV are not just people who fucking draw the pictures and then leave it to everybody else. You are you work on the show. You are someone who comes up with like all of the unique poses and expressions that characters will have. Stuff that's not credited enough, I would say. The manga reviews section of this is really funny because it speaks to how paltry the selection of manga must have been at the time. That there's a review of the latest Battle Angel Alita volume, a review of Sanctuary, and then reviews individually of 3 different volumes of Oh My Goddess. So there wasn't enough manga coming out to avoid reviewing 3 separate issues of Oh My Goddess. Video reviews are given a few more pages in the manga reviews, but again, there are reviews of individual tapes, 2 different Devil Hunter Yoko episodes, which I think is totally fair because, like, Devil Hunter Yoko is very different from episode to episode, so I could totally see wanting to write separate reviews. There's also porn reviews. In fact, I think this very first one is a porn review going by the image up there. Oh, in fact, the second review is F3, which is a great porn anime. I can't believe it's fucking was reviewed this long ago. I only gave it 2 stars, but it's good. But yeah, I generally love that they did not shy away from, like, reviewing, like, all the porn that was coming out. Like, obviously, that is a big part of the culture, and a lot of people reading your magazine, regardless of how much they want anime to not be looked at exclusively as sex and violence, are totally into the sex and violence. Here we've got an entertaining article, Mobile Fighter G Gundam: The Last Degradation, which is a very scathing review of G Gundam because of the fact that, it's not Gundam. And it's interesting because this is written at a time when the show is fairly new on television, and at the time, G Gundam would have been a major offense. It was the first non-canon, non-Universal Century Gundam series. I don't know if what's it called counts. The one that's like a Rekka 7 kind of. I don't know if that one's in the UC. I think it is. It's just like way in the future, but it's fairly irrelevant. But this one, G Gundam, is the first one that like totally broke the tone of Gundam. It's a super robot show. It's got nothing to do with the original stuff. So at the time, it was seen as a huge slight, and like people were not into it. But over time, as alternate century Gundam has become its own beast, that there's even more of it, you know, well, not more of it than you see, but like there's a shitload of alternate century, and that's the stuff that mostly became popular in the West, stuff like Gundam Wing, Gundam Seed, Gundam 00, and in retrospect, G Gundam is so much better than all of the other alternate century shows that now it's like a beloved cult classic, you know, where plenty of Gundam fans adore G Gundam, but at the time it was a big slight, and they were not happy about it. Now, here we get into the male section, Voice of the Freedom Fighter, and this is really fascinating because one of the unique aspects of Protoculture Addicts is that it is very much a collaborative magazine. A lot of the articles are submitted by fans. People would just send them reviews and write-ups of stuff, and they would post it in the magazine. Sometimes uncredited if the people didn't even include a name on it, but if they did, they'd put it at the bottom. So yeah, like a lot of this is just cobbled together random thoughts and reviews of anime fans. It's like reading Mal reviews almost. And some of them are written about as well as Mal reviews, to be perfectly honest, but others are better. And it's amazing how much they're willing to put like criticism of the magazine into the letters section, conversations, people just kind of having correspondence via this mail section, because correspondence was so integral to people being anime fans at the time. Like, there are some times in here, this guy talks about how he's hoping for people, he says, "Dear PA, I am writing you in hopes of getting in contact with other Robotech fans in the US or Canada. I am an avid Robotech fan and collector, and I would love to hear from anyone who could help build my Robotech collection." And then he goes on to give his full address, like, in the hopes of receiving correspondence from Robotech fans, which is followed immediately by the next letter, which begins, "Dear PA, I am writing to comment about anime fans who are still dwelling on the Robotech saga. Robotech is old news. Don't get me wrong or anything, Robotech was a great story, but with new anime being released every month with higher standards of art and soundtracks, how can people still refer to the Robotech saga as being great? I own the whole Robotech series and I have enjoyed watching it, but I would rather watch Bubblegum Crisis, Ranma 1/2, or the Oh My Goddess series any day. Robotech is not forgotten, but it is old animation from the mid-80s that cannot compare to newer animation being released in the mid-90s. So, yeah, this is, I mean, these are just fucking replace the names in any of these. And this is shit that I have read on every fucking forum in the world. This guy's got a longer letter, but my favorite section of it, he says, "And lastly, I noticed that some people, like John McLeroy from issue 29 letter column, want to see Robotech the movie on tape. Before I go any farther, I must warn everyone. I have seen it many times on video and in the theater, and it is bad, just like people say it is. But if you really want to see it, tell Canon Films they have the right to it." And he goes on and on about that. I think it's really interesting that, like, Robotech was such a big deal, but this movie was not getting released, which of course I'm assuming he's referring to Macross Do You Remember Love, which is a very contentious movie. There are some people who love that movie because it's extremely gorgeous, but the story doesn't make any sense, is the consensus I always hear. So a lot of people really hate that movie, and it's kind of like, it's almost like the prequels, for the Star Wars prequels for like anime fans of the time, as being like this incredibly big release that was incredibly disappointing and confusing for a lot of people. But the fact that it had not had a video release means that all anybody has is rumors and hearsay about how bad it is. That's pretty fucking funny. Anyways, that's about all the stuff that really caught my attention in this particular issue of Protoculture Addicts. I'll definitely be covering more of these magazines in the future because I've read a couple others and they're all fucking great. Huge thanks to the guy who sent me these, Kira from my patron Discord. Shout out to you for finally, I didn't want to start doing magazine videos until I got some Protoculture Addicts, because it's like the oldest magazine that I knew about. So, and I'm every bit as fascinated with it as I always hoped I would be. Here's the back cover with some, this isn't even Battletech. This is actual Robotech, actual Robotech miniatures. Was there a game for these? I have no idea. But anyway, yeah, join me. next time, and I'll talk about another anime magazine. And let me know what you thought of this, if you were informed or enthralled, or if you wish you had your own, or if you'd rather just read them vicariously through me, who will just pick out all of the noteworthy information and give it to you. See you next time.